So good evening, everyone. I'm Catherine from the Ridgefield Historical Society. Welcome to tonight's webinar, The Writing of the Star-Spangled Banner by Francis Scott Key, September 12th through 13th, 1814 with Ed Hynes. This program is co-presented with the Ridgefield Library and will be recorded and available on our website on July 13th. Special thanks to Fairfield County Bank for generously supporting this program. Ed Hynes, CFA, was born and raised in Wilton, Connecticut. He attended Wilton High School and currently lives in Norwalk. He and his wife are fascinated by history and have visited many important battlefields, both here and abroad. Ed graduated from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. with a BA in political science. He subsequently spent most of his career in financial services and is currently a financial advisor with Merrill Lynch in Westport, Connecticut. Ed will be taking your questions at the end of his presentation via the Q&A function located on the bottom of the screen. And I am delighted to welcome Ed to the program. So take it away, Ed.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure, as always, to work with the Ridgefield Historical Society and also the Ridgefield Library. So I'm going to share my screen here. And so hopefully everyone can see the screen. Karen, maybe you can affirm that you can see the screen.
Yes, we can see the screen.
Okay, great. So the Star-Spangled Banner, we all know it. We all know the words. It is one of our, most passionate songs about our country and about patriotism. But I want to tell a little story about just how Francis Scott Key came to write the Star-Spangled Banner. It was in the middle of the War of 1812. So we're going to talk about the War of 1812. And then we're going to really listen and speak to the words in the Star-Spangled Banner. Because, I think many people don't get the full flavor of what Francis Scott Key is trying to convey in the Star-Spangled Banner. So here's the punchline, okay? Francis Scott Key with Dr. Beans and Mr. Skinner are on a British warship when the British are about to attack Fort McHenry in Baltimore. They're trying to negotiate the release of Dr. Beans, and finally the British agree to release him. But they can't let them out of British control right now because they're about to attack Fort McHenry and they don't want their plans to be known. So what they do is they take Francis Scott Key and Dr. Beans and Mr. Skinner, and they put them on a smaller ship, and they move them about 5 or 6 miles away from Fort McHenry. They start the bombardment of Fort McHenry in the afternoon. It keeps going into the evening. And as we know from the song, they know the flag is still there because of the bombs bursting in air. Well, what many people don't know that happened next is at about 3 o'clock in the morning, everything stopped. The British stopped bombarding. And Francis Scott Key and the other two gentlemen were like, what happened? Did we surrender? And they were so frustrated and so scared that we might have surrendered. And they're waiting for the dawn's early light to see if the flag is still there. So this is the story. They were scared to death that America had just died, and they're waiting for the sun to come up to find out if it was true or not. So the first thing we're going to do here is I'm going to play. So our Star-Spangled Banner, the song, is the first verse of a 4-verse poem that Key wrote. And so the first thing I want to do tonight is I'm going to have just the narrative, not singing, just the narrative of all 4 stanzas come up on the screen.
Star-Spangled Banner by Francis Scott Key. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the clouds of the fight over the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming? And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave? On that shore dimly seen through the mists of the deep, where the foe's haughty hosts in dread silence reposes, what is that which the breeze over the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, now conceals, now discloses? Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam, in full glory reflected, now shines on the stream. 'Tis the star-spangled banner. Oh, long may it wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave. And where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country, should leave us no more? Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. And the star-spangled banner in triumph doth wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave. Oh, thus be it ever when freemen shall stand between their loved homes and the war's desolation. Blessed with victory and peace may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be our motto: in God is our trust. And the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
So you've now heard the spoken version of the 4-stanza poem, and I'm sure for most people, or for many people, if they haven't paid attention to the words as closely as I'm asking you to, we haven't known the real intent and the real the fear in the words. So this was happening during the War of 1812. So I want to tell you a little bit about the War of 1812. As we all know, it was with the British. Somewhat, we're taught in grade school that it was because the British were taking American soldiers and formerly British soldiers off American ships. And that was going on. But this conflict was a long conflict that had really simmered ever since the end of the American Revolution. It was mostly about trade. And James Madison, when he was elected president in 1808, he was pro-war. And he basically got really nasty with both England and France in the next 2 years. That didn't work out at all. So many pro-war people were elected to Congress in 1810, and Madison tried a different tact. He said to both Britain and France, here's the deal. Whoever takes it, I will trade with them. And if you don't take it, the country that does not take it, we're not going to trade with them. So one of the things that we all know, that communication was very slow, and the war could have been avoided if only the telegraph had been invented 40 years earlier. The US declared war on the British, but it did it one day after the British agreed in London to compromise with us. This also happened at the end of the war, where the war was finished and the treaties were agreed to before the Battle of New Orleans. So this war, had a bad way from the get-go. All wars are bad, but this was just really sad the way it happened. In the beginning of the war, the English started the convoy to get back and forth across the Atlantic to the West Indies, and the Americans would harass these various convoys. I'm going to make the war really simple, obviously much too simple, but there were in 1812, at the beginning of the war, there were 3 major naval engagements in the Atlantic. And the Americans had assumed that the British would always win every naval battle because they were the best in the world. But in these 3 naval engagements during 1812, America won all 3 of them, and it surprised everyone. The Congress of the United States thought that we were so inferior to the British that they would not even appropriate money to build ships because they considered it a waste of time. So a lot of thinking changed during the first year of the war about how well America could do, but how poorly some of the English captains also fought. This illustrates those three battles. They happened in August, then in October, and then in December of 1812. 1813, the U.S. attempts to take Canada. We failed for the second time in less than 40 years. And it turns out by today, we've invaded Canada more than we've attacked any other country. And every time they shoot back, and it hasn't worked. So this illustrates some of the major battles in 1813. The first in the spring is the Americans attack York, which is today's Toronto. And they burnt York to the ground. Later on in the fall, in September, we have the Battle of Lake Erie. We also have other battles around Detroit and into Canada. A lot of these turned out to be stalemates, but the Canadians and the British were able to keep us out of Canada during 1813. 1814, the British decide to launch a three-pronged attack on the US. The main attack was to split the US by moving down Lake Champlain and the Hudson River. There was also going to be an attack on New Orleans to control the Mississippi River and move up the Mississippi River. And finally, the third attack was going to be on the Chesapeake and was going to attack primarily Washington and Baltimore. This is the first attack of coming down Lake Champlain. And I want to describe this in detail because it's very interesting how the Americans were able to win this battle and do quite well. The main commander of the Americans is Commander McDonough, and his fleet was inferior to the British fleet that was coming down Lake Champlain. So what he decided to do is he set up his ships here in the blue. And one of the really cool things he did is he set up each of his ships so that they had a kedge anchor at the stern so they could turn the ships. And it's really quite clever how you can turn ships that way. Well, he moved his so what McDonough did is I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my screen here. What McDonough did here is he sets up his ship, but he's hiding behind this Cumberland Head, which is a large, it's a very, very large hill. And so the British are coming south from Canada and they see McDonough's ships here and they have to attack. They can't leave them in the rear. And so when they come around to start to attack, they lose the wind because Cumberland Head is blocking the wind from their ships. And so now they're floundering a little bit. McDonough's got his ships in good shape. He starts firing at the British as they try to maneuver. Eventually, after a couple of hours, both sides the ships are quite destroyed. And at this point, McDonough uses these anchors and he cuts one anchor and he pulls in the other anchor, and basically it shifts all of his ships by 180 degrees. So now he's got fresh guns facing the British. And with that, after a little bit more, the British had to concede and they sailed back to Canada. So the Americans were able to stop the British from coming. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble here. Sorry about that. And then the attack on at the end of the war, as we mentioned, on New Orleans. This is just a schematic of that attack. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but Jackson, he won this battle with his other generals and his men. And Jackson did a great job, and it really propelled his career, as we all know. And eventually he became president of the United States, probably primarily because of the Battle of New Orleans. Now let's get to the action in the center of the country. So the British come up in late August, they come up to the Chesapeake Bay, and they move up the rivers, and eventually they disembark, and the troops march to Upper Marlboro in Maryland. At this point, the General Jones takes control of Dr. Beans's home in Upper Marlboro. It's a nice house, and so they agree that he can take it and use it as his military headquarters. Dr. Beans and Jones also agreed at this point that if the Americans don't harass the British in this town, the British will not burn it to the ground when they leave. And so they make a gentleman's agreement that that will happen. So we have Dr. Beans, who is a prominent doctor in Upper Marlboro. We have Major General Robert Ross, and he's the British commander of the raid on Washington. As I mentioned, when he reached Upper Marlboro, he commandeered Dr. Beans's house. And we also have Francis Scott Key, who was raised in Upper Marlboro and worked as a lawyer in Georgetown, which is part of Washington, D.C. This is a schematic of Baltimore, but I'm gonna come. So what happens next is that after the British attacked Washington, I'll go back up here. So the British attacked Washington, as we all know, and we've been talking about recently, and that was the last time the Capitol was attacked in 1814. On the way back, the British, got a little rowdy when they were in Upper Marlboro, and Dr. Beans was really mad because he thought he had an agreement with the British that they wouldn't do any of this stuff. And so what he did is he arrested some of the British soldiers. He had some of his men arrest the British soldiers. Ross found out about this, and he was livid also. He was like, Dr. Beans has gone bad on his gentleman's agreement. Somebody please go arrest him immediately. And so they arrested Dr. Beans and his accomplices and took him into custody. They let everyone else go, but they took Dr. Beans onto the British warship and sailed to Baltimore. At this point, James Madison, the president, needed to negotiate for Dr. Beans to get out of, to release him. And so he asked Francis Scott Key, who was a lawyer, and also a gentleman named Mr. Skinner, who was in charge of prisons and soldiers and so forth. So they went to Baltimore under a flag of truce. They went out to the main flagship of the British Navy. They negotiated, and Ross at first was like, no way, I'm not letting this guy go, period. But one of the smart things that Skinner had done is that after the battle in Washington and in the Battle of Gettysburg, Dr. Beans actually helped save the lives of some of the British soldiers. And Skinner brought letters testifying from the British soldiers that their lives were saved by Dr. Beans. When Ross saw these letters, he was eventually convinced that Dr. Beans was not that bad of a guy, and he agreed to let him go. But the British had now been in Baltimore preparing to attack Fort McHenry for a few days. And Beans and Skinner and Key obviously knew exactly what they were planning to do. And so the British could not let them go. So they had to hold them through the Battle of Fort McHenry. They offloaded them to a smaller ship, and they moved them probably to a range of 7 to 8 miles away from Fort McHenry. And this is a schematic of where everything was. There were battles the first day. The day before the bombardment of Fort McHenry, the Americans did quite well. So then the bombardment of Fort McHenry started in the afternoon of September 13th. During that, they bombarded. And as I said earlier in the show, they bombarded, it went into the nighttime. They could see that the flag was still there and was still flying because of the bombs bursting in air. And finally, at 3 o'clock in the morning, everything stopped. And the Americans were concerned about what happened. Did America surrender? Because obviously they were really scared of that, and they couldn't understand why would there be any other reason for the British to stop the bombardment. So they're waiting for the sun to come up. And as the song goes, you know, by dawn's early light, is our flag still there? And I hope everybody has a much better appreciation for those words after tonight's short talk. So a week later, after the poem was written, it was published in the American Commercial Daily Advertiser, and it was titled "The Defense of Fort McHenry," and it was a hit. I mean, it was published in many newspapers after that, up and down the coast. Key took it to Thomas Carr, a music publisher, who adapted it to the rhythms of John Smith's Ukrainian in Heaven, a popular tune on both sides of the Atlantic at this time. And in 1889, the Star-Spangled Banner was approved by the Navy for official use. Woodrow Wilson signed an executive order naming the Star-Spangled Banner as our national anthem in 1916. And finally, in 1931, Congress passed and the president signed a law naming the song as America's national anthem. So I've listened to a lot of different people sing this song, and I went through, but this version is certainly one of my favorites, and it's why I'm going to play it now. So I ask you all to listen and really appreciate the words as she sings them. Now, one thing about the last line of our national anthem, in the poem, the last line of the first stanza ends with a question mark, which is kind of weird, probably the only country that has a national anthem that ends with a question mark. But the same line is repeated at the end of the fourth stanza with an explanation point. And when we sing our national anthem, we always sing the last line with the explanation point, not the question mark. So here we go.
Please stand and remove your caps for our national anthem. Following the anthem, please direct your attention to the sky, where two Navy FA-18s from Fighter Composite Squadron 12 will be performing a flyover. Now for tonight's national anthem, please welcome 5-time Grammy winner and 3-time Country Music Female Vocalist of the Year, Martina McBride.
Oh, so can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets regular, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say
So I hope people enjoyed that. I hope you know, I have trouble listening to her sing that song without tearing up. It's just the emotion. Once you capture Key's emotion and how he wrote the song, it's hard not to get emotional every time you see it. And I hope this lecture inspires you all to get emotional every time you hear it.
Great, thank you so much, Ed. And we're open for questions. If anyone would like to ask Ed a question, so please feel free to type in the Q&A. Oh, here we have question number 1. So there has been much controversy over the 3rd stanza of the poem. What is your interpretation of it?
So I know some of the controversy, certainly, you know, about hirelings and slaves and so forth. And the British actively did recruit slaves, okay, to fight against us, and promised them freedom if they would fight for them, okay. And so, you know, I don't know. I think it's sort of a commentary on what was going on rather than an extra brutal commentary.
We have another question from Michelle. Was Keyes a poet in addition to being a lawyer?
Yes, to some extent, for sure. And he was very determined. So this all happened, he wrote this in 1814. He actually wrote an anthem for the United States in 1805. It just didn't catch on. And he wrote it to the same music. Okay. So he was determined. And, you know, and he's got a long lineage after him of people that were writers and poets and so forth. So it's Francis Scott Key, but F. Scott Fitzgerald is a descendant and he's got the same initials.
Great. Anyone else with a question? Feel free to put it in the Q&A. Anyone else before we? Oh,
Yeah, there we
go.
Here we go.
Here we
There
go.
we got 2 there now. Keep it on. Keep it up.
So who decided what music to put the poem to? They're perfect together.
I think Thomas Carr, okay, who we took it to, was a music arranger and did music. And so I suspect they collaborated on it together so that it would, so they had to reword parts of it, I'm sure, so that it would fit the music.
Great. Will asks, what did happen in the middle of the night? Why did they stop?
Oh, great question. And I should have covered it. So the British had approximately 2,500 soldiers with them that had fought against the Americans the day before and had also fought going to Washington. And the British determined, well, a couple of things happened. First of all, Ross was killed. Okay, so their commander was killed the previous day, okay, at the Battle of Baltimore. And I'm not sure how much that influenced their decisions, but their commander was killed, and they decided that with 2,500 soldiers, they were not going to be able to attack America and win. The Americans just had way too many people. I mean, they had a lot of people in Washington. They had a lot of men the day before in Baltimore, and they realized that, you know, America can just keep producing soldiers, and they have 2,500, and it wasn't going to work. So they decided to give up, which is why, you know, why nobody understood why it stopped at 3 o'clock in the morning. There's really no other explanation that would make any sense. I mean, they didn't run out of cannon.
How did the release of the prisoners play out?
Well, so eventually Ross decided that he would release Dr. Beans, and I think they were still on that ship for a few more days, and then I believe during the day of the battle is when they were removed to a smaller ship and moved away from the harbor, but I'm not 100% sure of that. And then obviously, you know, the British after the battle, that next day, they were just released onto the land. Exactly where, I'm not sure, but they were released that day.
So Laura says, I'm so excited to hear you talk about Commander McDonough, a Connecticut native, I think.
You may be right. I think you are right. But he's got a lot going for him. He's obviously Irish. But it was one of the interesting things about looking at battles and battlefields and so forth, is just to determine what one side or the other did, okay, that made them a winner, okay. And here you had a guy that had inferior ships that were slower, they had less firepower, but he was able to figure out how to put the British in a situation where he could use his ships and the maneuverability to win the battle. And we sort of have a history of stopping the British coming down. Arnold stopped the British in almost the same spot in 1776 when the British were trying to come south, and basically was able to buy the colonies another winter to prepare for the British eventually coming south. And when they tried the next winter, we defeated them at Saratoga.
And somebody just commented there is a monument to McDonough in Plattsburgh, New York.
Yeah, I've not seen it, but that's where it would be. That's where.
So David said, very good lecture. So nice compliment for you, Ed. Bob said you might talk about General Ross, who was killed in Maryland, which you did already. I don't know if you have anything else that you'd like to add about that.
I don't really. I don't know very much about General Ross.
Okay. Why did it take so many years for the song to be adopted as the national anthem?
Good question. I don't know the complete answer, but there were other competitors. So "O Columbia," okay, was also vying to become our national anthem. And so and there wasn't necessarily a push for one either. So, but people, there were a lot of different songs that people liked at that point.
Michelle asks, I've never understood the War of 1812, following pretty soon after the Revolutionary War ended. What was the British motive in engaging in this war?
Well, the British were at war with everyone. So in 1812, their main focus was on Napoleon in France, okay? People talk about us winning a few naval battles, especially early in the war. I've heard people speculate, and I don't know, but I don't disagree that, they sent their second string to fight America. Their first string was fighting Napoleon, okay? But they were fighting everyone. They eventually decided that it wasn't going to work. The way the war was fought, you never really felt the British were in it to win, and they had agreed to compromise before it even started. So there's a lot of things there.
And this is the same person who mentioned about the museum or Plattsburgh, New York, the monument, and she says there's a dandy little museum of the War of 1812. So thank you for that for anyone who wants to take a trip up to Plattsburgh. And just another comment, thank you so much, Ed, you're fantastic. Thank you, Chelsea, I'm lovely to hear. And we have no more questions at the moment, so I'm just gonna put it out for another second. Does anyone else have any more questions they'd like to ask Ed? And if not, we'll conclude for tonight. So just last call for questions.
I'll just jump in for a second. So
sure.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, that's great to know about the Museum of 1812 in Plattsburgh. Plattsburgh is lovely. I would recommend visiting by anyone, and taking the ferry across to Burlington is always fun also. The other thing is, if you have a chance, visit Fort McHenry in Baltimore. Okay, if you're driving through the tunnel's named Fort McHenry. You get off at the exit in a couple of miles, and it's fascinating. And you get to see one of the largest American flags in the world. The person in charge of Fort McHenry during this period had purposely bought the largest flag he could get. And he kept telling everybody he wanted to make sure the English could see it from England. Okay. So they were very, and so they still fly this huge flag. And when you talk to the Rangers, you know, they tell this story, you know, 10 times better than I do. So I would highly recommend it.
Great. All right, well, I think the queue is empty. So thank you, Ed, for another fascinating presentation. And we are going to do the whaleboats presentation in the fall. So stay tuned for that. There'll be more information coming up.